The Application Lifecycle Risk Management Podcast, Episode 22, My Visual Studio Toolbox. Last week, I started on a blog post about tools I use, and it ended up being about the tools I use for blogging and podcasting. Today, I thought I'd work on something a little bit more generic and look at what's in my Visual Studio Toolbox. So first, ReSharper. This is my main tool. I like it so much that I think at this point I'd be pretty lost without it. Why? Well, how about the on-the-fly code analysis? ReSharper tells me when I've made a stupid mistake long before I've actually compiled my code. It even does this for code that isn't compiled, like JavaScript, catching many of the really stupid errors that I make. Or how about automatic code refactoring? Not only can it tell you that you've made a mistake, but it can also suggest better ways of coding. I initially learned LINQ by letting ReSharper convert many of my for each loops into LINQ code. Do you have a variable that you've declared 1,000,000 miles from where it's actually used? ReSharper can move the declaration closer to where it is supposed to be used. Or do you need to change the name of a method or a property? No need to recompile to find all the places where you were using that. ReSharper can do a lot of that work for you. The only place where it can't is if you're referencing the property or method in a string. Or how about improved IntelliSense? Okay, so before I got ReSharper, I didn't know what I was missing. But not only will ReSharper tell you what is possible, if you type something in and it isn't available because you're missing a reference to a DLL, it can figure out what DLL should be referenced, and it will ask you if you want to add the reference. Similarly, if you add a reference to a class in your code and you've not yet added a using statement, you'll be asked if you'd like to add the using statement to your code. Sweet. Ever copied code from another file? When you paste it in, you basically have to add references to using statements as a second step. Figuring all that out takes time. ReSharper asks if you'd like to add the using statements immediately after pasting the code. Or coding standards. I've always been a big fan of naming conventions. ReSharper can help you maintain those coding standards. You can get a free 30-day trial at JetBrains. The other plugin that I use in Visual Studio a lot is Web Essentials. Web Essentials is a free plugin for Visual Studio that adds a few more tricks to Visual Studio web development. I first found this when I got interested in less, but I've become pretty dependent on it. Many of the features that first show up in Web Essentials eventually show up in Visual Studio. So you can think of Web Essentials as Visual Studio vNext. I particularly like the enhancements this plugin adds to my CSS and JavaScript coding. Finally, the Productivity Power Tools. I originally got the Productivity Power Tools because it has a present on command that lets you bump up the font size of Visual Studio, not just the window you're working on. I use this quite a bit when I present code. But since I got it, I've also fallen in love with a feature that puts a squiggly in my Solution Explorer indicating where I have errors in my code. By turning on JS Hint in Web Essentials and using this squiggly feature, I've been able to keep my JavaScript code pretty clean. So, those are the main tools that I use, and I think everyone should include in their toolbox. But there are a few others that you might want to take a look at. Like, and I have no idea how to really pronounce this, but ANKS SVN is ANKH SVN. It allows you to access Subversion from Visual Studio. Or SpecFlow, which I've blogged about before, a behavior-driven development testing tool that works with multiple test runners. Or CodeMade. I'll let you check that out. And CodeLens. Now, CodeLens only works with Visual Studio Ultimate, but what it does is it provides code metrics to help you keep your code maintainable and shows it in the heads-up display that's been added in Visual Studio 2013 Ultimate. So those are the tools that I'm using, and maybe you'll take a look at them. For the links to items mentioned in this podcast, make sure you check out my blog at blog.dmbcllc.com. A link to this article is in the show description.